The sky was streaked with the last orange hues of daylight as 16-year-old Emily walked along the narrow trail that curled behind the neighborhood. Her golden retriever, Max, tugged playfully at the leash, tail wagging as he sniffed every patch of earth with uncontainable curiosity. It was a walk they had done countless times before. The quiet forest path was a comforting routine, a place Emily often went to think, listen to music, or just unwind. That evening, she had left home a little after 6:30 p.m., wearing a navy hoodie, leggings, and white sneakers. Her phone's music played faintly from her pocket. She waved briefly to a neighbor tending to their lawn, the last confirmed person to see her. As she and Max drifted deeper into the trail, the canopy overhead grew thicker, filtering out the remaining light. The forest was familiar, but it turned eerie fast as the wind stirred the leaves and birds retreated to their nests. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. At 8:12 p.m., Max showed up back at Emily's doorstep, panting, leash trailing behind him, visibly shaken and with a scrape on his side. But there was no sign of Emily. Her parents' initial confusion turned to dread. Calls to her phone went straight to voicemail. They drove the trail, called her name into the trees, even walked the loop themselves, thinking maybe she'd twisted her ankle or gotten distracted. When it became clear she wasn't answering and wasn't coming home, they called 911. Within an hour, local police arrived, flashlights cutting through the darkness. Helicopters circled above with searchlights, and neighbors joined the frantic search. Nothing was found that night. No footprints, no dropped phone, no torn clothing. Just silence. Emily had vanished, as if the woods had swallowed her whole. The early morning light cast a dull gray over the forest as search teams regrouped at the trailhead. Word of Emily's disappearance had spread fast overnight, and by dawn, dozens of volunteers, neighbors, classmates, even strangers, had joined local police and fire departments. Dogs trained in scent tracking were brought in, their handlers urgently presenting Emily's hoodie and a pillow from her room. Max, the family's golden retriever, paced nervously near the house, seemingly unsettled by what had happened. The search began methodically. Teams fanned out in grids, marking each area covered with colored tape. Drones hovered above, scanning the treetops and paths below. Police checked for any nearby surveillance footage but found nothing beyond the short clip of Emily leaving home. Forensic teams examined the trail, the areas surrounding it, and where Max had emerged from the woods, but there were no obvious signs of struggle or foul play. It was as though she had stepped off the trail and vanished into thin air. Over the next several days, the search widened. Crews dredged nearby streams and small ponds. Volunteers combed through overgrown brush, abandoned sheds, and storm drains. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew overhead each night. Nothing. Flyers were printed and stapled to telephone poles. Emily's face was everywhere, on social media, on news broadcasts, at candlelight vigils held in town. Her disappearance struck fear into the heart of the community. Parents began walking their children to school again. Joggers avoided the trails. The forest that had once felt like a safe escape now seemed ominous, dangerous. By the end of the second week, momentum slowed. Tips trickled in but led nowhere. A few reported hearing screams on the night she vanished, others claimed to have seen someone following her weeks prior. Investigators followed every lead, but none led to Emily. Her phone's last ping placed her in the woods, but the signal stopped abruptly. There were no active leads, no suspects, and no explanation. As summer turned to fall, hope faded. The case was officially classified as cold. As the weeks turned into months, Emily's disappearance became more than just a mystery, it became a haunting presence that lingered over the town. The posters with her face began to fade in the sun and curl at the corners, but people still left flowers and candles near the trailhead where she was last seen. The police, having exhausted their resources and followed every credible lead, were now only checking in periodically, waiting for something new to surface. But nothing ever did. In the absence of answers, theories began to grow like weeds. At first, they were whispers, private conversations between neighbors, subtle suggestions shared at grocery stores or school pickups. Then the internet got involved. Local forums and Facebook groups lit up with speculation. Some believed Emily had run away, maybe she'd wanted to escape, to start fresh somewhere else. After all, she was 16. Others angrily dismissed that idea. Emily was close to her family, had no known issues at school, no notes left behind, and no history of wanting to disappear. Soon the rumors took on darker tones. A few people believed she'd been taken, kidnapped by someone familiar with the forest, someone who had planned it. One commenter wrote about a strange man seen parked near the woods a few days before her disappearance, while another claimed there had been a string of similar incidents in nearby towns, all dismissed too quickly by police. No connection was ever confirmed. Stranger still were the unexplainable reports. A jogger claimed she heard faint crying deep in the woods late one night. A hiker, months later, said he saw a figure dart between trees and vanish. One particularly chilling story came from a group of teens who said they saw a light in the woods that blinked 3 times, then went out, like someone was trying to signal. No one could agree on what it all meant. There were no footprints, no evidence left behind. Emily's name became almost taboo. Friends who used to walk the trail avoided it now. Kids at her high school spoke of her like a ghost, someone frozen in time, someone both gone and somehow still there. The town held on to hope, but it had changed. It was no longer the hope of seeing her walk through the door, but the hope that, one day, they might at least understand what happened. The forest was quiet again, just as it had been for months. Snow had come and gone, followed by spring rains and the steady creep of summer heat. Life in town moved forward, but for some, like Tom Hensley, the forest never lost its weight. Tom was a 52-year-old hunter and former military scout who had spent the better part of 3 decades navigating those woods. He knew every bend in the trail, every hidden creek, every game path used by deer and coyotes. To him, the woods weren't a place of mystery, they were a second home. That early morning in late October, Tom parked his truck on a gravel turn-off just after 5 a.m., coffee in hand, rifle slung over his shoulder. It was the first day of bow season, and the air was still heavy with pre-dawn fog. He hiked in half a mile, his boots barely making a sound on the damp earth. After settling into his usual tree stand, he pulled out a new piece of gear he'd been excited to test, a compact thermal drone with a mounted high-resolution camera. It was meant to scout game from the sky, a way to cover ground quickly without disturbing the brush. With the drone launched, Tom scanned the treetops and canopy breaks on his handheld monitor. Patches of heat lit up across the screen, deer mostly, a few raccoons, and the occasional bird nested in branches. But after about 15 minutes, as he skimmed the southern edge of a ravine, a part of the forest that had always felt oddly colder, damper, even in the summer, he spotted something that made him pause. In the clearing just beyond a rocky outcrop, there was a stationary heat signature, upright, humanoid, and oddly still. It wasn't crouched like an animal or moving like a hiker. It stood there, faintly glowing in orange, with no other heat sources around it. Tom squinted. He adjusted the drone's position for a better angle, and as he did, the figure moved, just slightly, as if it had turned its head. And then it vanished. One moment it was there, the next, gone behind the curve of the land, swallowed by shadow. Tom's heart thudded in his chest. He wasn't the kind of man to spook easily, but this wasn't right. No one should be out there, especially not at this hour, and certainly not alone in that particular part of the forest. He replayed the footage twice on the monitor, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. Human, animal, illusion, he couldn't say, but something about the proportions, the stillness, the posture, unsettled him deeply. He packed up, flew the drone back, and made a silent decision. This wasn't something to ignore. He'd seen something real. And maybe, just maybe, it was connected to the girl the forest had kept for far too long. The forest was quiet again, just as it had been for months. Snow had come and gone, followed by spring rains and the steady creep of summer heat. Life in town moved forward, but for some, like Tom Hensley, the forest never lost its weight. Tom was a 52-year-old hunter and former military scout who had spent the better part of 3 decades navigating those woods. He knew every bend in the trail, every hidden creek, every game path used by deer and coyotes. To him, the woods weren't a place of mystery, they were a second home. That early morning in late October, Tom parked his truck on a gravel turn-off just after 5 a.m., coffee in hand, rifle slung over his shoulder. It was the first day of bow season, and the air was still heavy with pre-dawn fog. He hiked in half a mile, his boots barely making a sound on the damp earth. After settling into his usual tree stand, he pulled out a new piece of gear he'd been excited to test, a compact thermal drone with a mounted high-resolution camera. It was meant to scout game from the sky, a way to cover ground quickly without disturbing the brush. With the drone launched, Tom scanned the treetops and canopy breaks on his handheld monitor. Patches of heat lit up across the screen, deer mostly, a few raccoons, and the occasional bird nested in branches. But after about 15 minutes, as he skimmed the southern edge of a ravine, a part of the forest that had always felt oddly colder, damper, even in the summer, he spotted something that made him pause. In the clearing just beyond a rocky outcrop, there was a stationary heat signature, upright, humanoid, and oddly still. It wasn't crouched like an animal or moving like a hiker. It stood there, faintly glowing in orange, with no other heat sources around it. Tom squinted. He adjusted the drone's position for a better angle, and as he did, the figure moved, just slightly, as if it had turned its head. And then it vanished. One moment it was there, the next, gone behind the curve of the land, swallowed by shadow. Tom's heart thudded in his chest. He wasn't the kind of man to spook easily, but this wasn't right. No one should be out there, especially not at this hour, and certainly not alone in that particular part of the forest. He replayed the footage twice on the monitor, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. Human, animal, illusion, he couldn't say. But something about the proportions, the stillness, the posture, unsettled him deeply. He packed up, flew the drone back, and made a silent decision. This wasn't something to ignore. He'd seen something real. And maybe, just maybe, it was connected to the girl the forest had kept for far too long. Back at home, Tom transferred the drone footage to his laptop, replaying it in full-screen mode. The grainy thermal feed wasn't crystal clear, but the shape was unmistakable. It wasn't just a blob of heat, it was tall, slender, with clearly defined arms and legs. The figure had been standing near a cluster of mossy rocks, mostly still except for a subtle tilt of the head just before it disappeared behind a jagged slope. Tom rewound that portion over and over. It wasn't an animal. It moved like a person. His hands hovered over the keyboard as he debated whether to report it. It had been nearly a year since Emily vanished, and most people had stopped mentioning her name. But what he saw, the location, the posture, the stillness, it didn't sit right. He printed out screenshots of the figure and marked the GPS coordinates from the drone's internal tracking system. Then he reached for the phone. Later that day, 2 sheriff's deputies visited his home. Tom walked them through the footage, pointing out the ravine and the moment the figure moved. The deputies were polite but reserved, clearly skeptical. Could be a poacher, one of them suggested. Could be a hiker. But when Tom told them the exact spot, how remote it was, how difficult it would be to reach without bushwhacking off trail, their tone shifted. With growing curiosity, one of the deputies forwarded the thermal screenshots to the missing persons unit. Within hours, a new team was quietly assembled. They compared the shape's dimensions to Emily's profile from the case file. The height was close. The figure's body heat also suggested it was alive, not residual or animal. It was enough to take seriously. A team of 5 returned with Tom the next morning, equipped with updated gear, infrared scopes, satellite maps, and a second drone. They followed the coordinates precisely, navigating steep inclines and tangled underbrush. As they neared the rocky outcrop, the air grew cooler, quieter, the thick canopy blocking much of the sun. And then they saw it. Not the figure, not this time, but a shallow depression in the earth, surrounded by flat stones that looked oddly arranged. Nearby, half buried under leaves, was a small scrap of dark blue fabric. One of the deputies crouched and held it up. It was torn, weathered by the elements, but it looked like it might have been part of a hoodie. The kind Emily was wearing when she disappeared. Even more chilling was what they found just beyond the ridge, a small cluster of symbols carved into the bark of a tree. Fresh, maybe a few days old. Just below them, someone had scratched 3 letters into the wood, ELM. The group exchanged glances. This wasn't a coincidence. Whatever the hunter's drone had picked up, it had led them somewhere real. The search wasn't over, it was just beginning again. The area was quickly cordoned off as law enforcement reclassified it as an active search zone. Word hadn't yet reached the media, but behind the scenes, things moved fast. A specialized search and rescue team arrived from the state capitol, equipped with ground-penetrating radar, thermal scanners, and tracking dogs. Officers familiar with Emily's case returned, this time with renewed urgency. The discovery of fabric matching her last known clothing, paired with the eerie initials carved into the tree, was the first real lead in almost a year. Tom stood quietly near the treeline as the new search unfolded, watching teams mark out grids and send dogs ahead into the brush. It was hard not to feel the weight of it, that this place, a forgotten ridge beyond an old ravine, might have been where Emily had spent the past year. The idea of her being alive, surviving here all this time, felt impossible. And yet, the signs pointed to something more than a tragic ending. Deep in the woods, one of the teams stumbled upon a narrow opening in the earth partially concealed by a curtain of vines and a collapsed tree. It was barely noticeable unless you were standing directly in front of it. A flashlight beam swept across the entrance, revealing what looked like a shallow cave. The air pouring from it was damp, cool, and stale, untouched by the outside world for who knows how long. Inside, the cave twisted slightly before widening into a low chamber. At first glance, it seemed empty. But then they saw the evidence: a makeshift bedding area of old leaves and torn cloth, a rusted tin cup, and scattered food wrappers, some so degraded they must have been there for months. Most disturbing were the walls. Etched into the stone with what looked like a sharp rock were dozens of small tally marks, all grouped in rows of 5. There were hundreds of them. At the far end of the chamber, the searchers found something even more startling: a thin leather strap with beads, the same kind Emily's mother had handmade for her birthday the year before she vanished. Next to it, a torn notebook page with faded, barely legible writing. The words were smudged and incomplete, but 2 could still be read clearly: still here. The cave was quickly declared a protected scene. Forensic teams moved in, collecting DNA samples, photographing every inch of the walls, bagging every item with extreme care. Meanwhile, the dogs continued searching the surrounding area, now even more focused. The air had changed, not just in temperature but in feeling. There was a collective tension, a quiet belief that they were no longer chasing a memory or a ghost. Someone had been here, possibly still was. Back at the mobile command post, the decision was made to expand the search perimeter another mile in every direction. Officers moved silently but with increasing urgency. If Emily had survived in these woods, hiding or held, the question now wasn't only where she had been, it was how she had stayed hidden for so long. And who, if anyone, had kept her that way. The forest was still when they found her. It happened on the 3rd day of the expanded search. One of the canine units veered off toward a narrow game trail that wound uphill through thick brush. The dog, a black German shepherd named Arrow, suddenly froze and began barking sharply, tail stiff, nose to the wind. The handler, a young woman named Jenna, radioed her location and slowly advanced, heart pounding. The others converged quickly, but quietly. They had learned by now that sudden noise only drove whatever they were chasing deeper into hiding. There, partially concealed beneath a tangle of fallen branches and overgrowth, was a second cave, smaller and drier than the first, almost impossible to notice unless you were within 10 feet. Jenna crouched near the entrance and called out softly, "Hello? Is anyone in there?" At first, there was only silence. Then, a rustling sound. Faint. Hesitant. A moment later, 2 wide, sunken eyes appeared from the darkness, reflecting the beam of her flashlight like glass. A girl. Thin. Filthy. Hair matted. Skin pale beneath layers of dirt. She didn't speak. She simply looked at them, not with fear, but with disbelief, like she wasn't sure if any of it was real. Jenna whispered into the radio, her voice trembling. "We found her. She's alive." Chaos and awe erupted in the command center. Paramedics rushed in with blankets, medical kits, and IV fluids. Emily didn't resist when they helped her out of the cave. Her legs trembled with each step, her body so fragile it looked like it might collapse under its own weight. But she never let go of what she was clutching tightly against her chest, a worn piece of cloth that looked like part of Max's old leash. She didn't say much at first. Her voice was hoarse, her words scattered, like someone learning to speak again. But she kept repeating the same phrase: "I stayed close. I thought someone would come." In the ambulance, as the medics worked gently to rehydrate and stabilize her, she finally offered a little more. She had survived on rainwater, berries, and small animals. She'd learned to stay hidden. When she heard people searching during those early weeks, she was too afraid to call out. She mentioned him, a man she never saw clearly, only heard. He was out there. Sometimes she'd find scraps of food left near the caves, and once, a set of footprints that didn't belong to her. It was never clear if he meant harm or was just watching, but she knew not to make herself known. She hadn't been running from rescue, she had been surviving from something else. Something that had never shown itself but had made the forest its home. The news broke within the hour. The girl who vanished a year ago while walking her dog had been found alive. Crowds gathered near the hospital, news vans arrived in waves, and messages flooded in from around the world. But behind the headlines and celebration, one thing was clear to everyone on the inside: this story wasn't over. Because while Emily had been found, whoever had haunted those woods, and possibly watched her from the shadows, was still out there. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the occasional beep of monitors. Emily lay in a clean bed, barely recognizable to those who had known her before. Her face was thinner, older somehow, marked by shadows under her eyes and a deep stillness that didn't belong to a 16-year-old. The doctors said she was dehydrated and malnourished, but stable. No broken bones, no serious infections. A medical miracle, they called it. But what she carried wasn't physical, it was deeper, something they couldn't treat with IVs or warm meals. Her parents sat by her side, holding her hand, tears in their eyes every time she glanced at them. It had been 384 days. A full year and then some. And now, here she was, back, but not quite the same. She rarely made eye contact. She spoke in a whisper, and never for long. She slept in bursts, waking from dreams that left her staring at the ceiling, unmoving, as if listening for sounds only she could hear. The investigators tried to be gentle when they questioned her, but they were desperate for answers. Who had been out there with her? Had she seen his face? Had he spoken to her? But every time they pressed, she recoiled. Her answers were fragmented. He watched, not close, but near. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps, but never voices. He left food. He never let me see him. She never said the word, kidnap, or abduct. It was as if she didn't fully understand what had happened to her, or maybe she did, and couldn't find the words for it. Meanwhile, law enforcement combed the woods again, this time with renewed aggression. Dozens of officers, cadaver dogs, high-tech surveillance gear. They found traces, old boot prints, bits of clothing, rusted cans, but nothing that clearly pointed to another person. No fingerprints. No DNA that wasn't hers. The man she described seemed to exist only in shadows. As if the forest had breathed him into being and taken him back just as silently. Psychologists warned that trauma could warp memory, that Emily might be merging fear with imagination, building a version of her ordeal that protected her from truths too dark to process. But others weren't so sure. The tally marks in the cave. The symbols carved into bark. The carefully placed offerings of food and water. This wasn't a child lost in the woods. This was something else. Something orchestrated. Someone had known she was there, and chose to keep her alive. Months passed. Emily returned home under heavy protection, but she rarely left her room. She kept her curtains closed and refused to walk outside without someone holding her hand. One night, her mother found her curled on the floor of her closet, whispering to herself, "He's still there. He doesn't like the noise." The case remained open, but cold. The media moved on. The town breathed a sigh of relief, then let the mystery settle back into legend. But for those closest to it, Tom, the deputies, Emily's parents, something still clung to the edges of their lives. Unfinished. Unanswered. And deep in the forest, past the caves and the marked trees, a motion-activated trail cam set up weeks after her rescue blinked on in the night. For a moment, its lens caught the shape of a man standing motionless beneath the branches. Tall, silent, watching. Then, just like that, he was gone.